Abigail adjusted her floral dress nervously, smoothing the fabric as she stepped into the brightly lit event hall. The room buzzed with conversations and laughter, the scent of fresh flowers blending with the soft aroma of champagne. It was a fundraiser for adaptive sports programs, an event close to her heart. As a physical therapist, Abigail had dedicated her life to helping others rebuild theirs, and tonight, she felt both proud and slightly out of place. She scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces, but her eyes stopped when she noticed him. Sitting near the corner table, a man in a wheelchair laughed at something a guest had said. There was an ease to his demeanor, as if the chair beneath him didn't define who he was. Abigail couldn't help but stare, intrigued by the warmth in his expression. Before she could stop herself, she made her way over. "Hi," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He turned, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Hey there." His smile was disarming, confident. "I'm Michael." "Abigail." She extended her hand, and he took it with a firm grip, surprising her with its strength. "So, Abigail," he said, leaning slightly forward, "are you here for the free food or are you one of the generous donors?" She laughed, instantly feeling at ease. "Neither. I actually work as a physical therapist, so I couldn't pass up supporting something this meaningful." "Ah," he said, nodding. "That explains the way you were looking at me." Her cheeks flushed. "I wasn't." He grinned. "Relax. I'm just messing with you." Abigail laughed again, her embarrassment fading as quickly as it had come. "What about you? How'd you end up here?" Michael hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "I've been part of the adaptive sports community for a while now. These events mean a lot to me." The way he said it made her want to know more, but she resisted pushing too hard. Instead, she let the conversation flow naturally. They talked about their interests, their families, and their shared love for hiking, something Michael admitted he missed since the accident that put him in the chair. An hour passed before either of them noticed. Abigail found herself captivated not just by his charm but by the way he talked about overcoming challenges. He didn't seem bitter or weighed down by his circumstances. Instead, he carried an optimism that felt contagious. As the night came to a close, Michael glanced at his watch and sighed. "Looks like I'm keeping you from mingling with all the important people." "You're the most interesting person I've talked to all night," Abigail said without thinking, then quickly added, "Not that I've talked to many people yet." Michael tilted his head, studying her. "I'd like to see you again, Abigail. Maybe somewhere quieter, where we don't have to compete with the noise." Her heart skipped a beat. "I'd like that too." They exchanged numbers before parting ways, and as Abigail stepped outside into the cool evening air, she realized her hands were trembling slightly. Something about Michael felt different, real. And despite the chair, despite the unknowns, she wanted to know him better. Little did she know, her world was about to be turned upside down. Abigail adjusted the cushions on her couch, nervously fluffing them for the third time. She glanced at her phone, checking the time. Michael was supposed to arrive any minute. It had been a week since they met at the fundraiser, and their daily texts had quickly turned into late-night phone calls filled with laughter and personal confessions. Tonight would be their first official date. Michael had insisted on picking her up, despite her protests about convenience. "I've got wheels," he joked. "I'll manage." The sound of a car door shutting outside made her peek through the curtains. A sleek black SUV sat in her driveway, and Michael was already maneuvering out with practiced ease. Abigail opened the door before he could ring the bell. "Hey," she said, smiling. "Hey yourself." He rolled closer, his gaze sweeping over her. "You look amazing." She laughed softly. "And you're right on time. Come on in." Michael glanced around her small but cozy living room. "Nice place." "Let me guess, you decorated it yourself?" "Guilty," she said. "I'm a sucker for warm tones and too many throw pillows." "It suits you." They settled onto the couch, the conversation flowing as naturally as it had at the fundraiser. Abigail found herself drawn deeper into Michael's stories, how he'd grown up in a small town, his love for camping and sports, and the accident that had changed everything. "It happened 3 years ago," he said, his voice softening. "A car crash. One moment I was fine, the next," he gestured toward the wheelchair. Abigail's heart clenched. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Michael shrugged. "It wasn't easy, but I had to make a choice, either let it break me or learn to live again. I chose the second option." Her admiration for him deepened. "You're incredible, you know that?" He smiled, but there was something guarded in his eyes. "I don't know about that. I've had my struggles, trust me." "Don't we all?" she said, reaching out to touch his hand. The moment lingered, and Michael looked down at their fingers intertwined. "You make it easy to talk about these things," he admitted. Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "I guess that's part of the job." "No," he said firmly. "It's just who you are." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics as Michael teased her about her obsession with coffee and her inability to cook without burning something. Abigail felt herself relax, letting her guard down in a way she hadn't done in years. Later that night, as Michael prepared to leave, he paused at the doorway. "I had a great time tonight," he said. "Thank you." "Me too." She hesitated before adding, "Maybe we could do this again?" "I'd like that." As she watched him drive away, Abigail felt something stir inside her, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone worth risking her heart for. The days turned into weeks, and Abigail's relationship with Michael grew deeper with every conversation, every shared meal, and every lingering glance. She had never felt so connected to someone before. It wasn't just his humor or charm, it was the way he made her feel seen, like every part of her mattered. One Saturday afternoon, Abigail stood in Michael's kitchen, laughing as she tried to chop vegetables for a stir-fry. "I swear I'm not this bad in the kitchen," she said, holding up a misshapen carrot. Michael smirked from his wheelchair, where he was slicing peppers with precision. "I think the evidence says otherwise." "Hey!" She threw a carrot slice at him, and he caught it effortlessly. "Reflexes," he said with a wink. They laughed, but as the moment faded, Abigail grew serious. "You make everything seem so easy," she said. Michael looked up. "What do you mean?" "This," she said, gesturing toward him. "The way you handle everything life's thrown at you. Most people would have given up, or at least become bitter, but you just keep moving forward." His expression softened. "It's not as effortless as it looks," he admitted. "There were days I wanted to give up. But then I realized I had two choices: let my circumstances define me or keep fighting for the life I wanted." Abigail's chest tightened. "I admire that about you." For the first time, Michael looked truly vulnerable. "What about you? What keeps you going?" She hesitated, then admitted, "I guess I've always been afraid of letting people down. That's why I chose this career, to make a difference. But sometimes I wonder if I'm too busy fixing everyone else to figure out what I really need." Michael reached for her hand, his thumb brushing against her skin. "Maybe you need someone to remind you that it's okay to take care of yourself too." Abigail smiled, and for the first time in a long time, she felt safe enough to believe him. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. "Abigail," he began, his voice steady but his eyes filled with emotion, "I've never met anyone like you. You see the best in people, even when they don't see it in themselves. Being with you has made me want to be a better man, to deserve the love you give so freely." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. He opened the box, revealing a delicate diamond ring. "I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Abigail's eyes as she nodded. "Yes. 1,000 times, yes." Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, and they held each other tightly, as if nothing could ever come between them. But as Abigail rested her head against his chest, a faint flicker of doubt stirred deep inside her, one she couldn't quite explain. Abigail stood in the middle of the bridal boutique, her reflection staring back at her in a sea of mirrors. The ivory gown she wore hugged her figure perfectly, its lace details delicate and intricate. She smoothed the fabric nervously, her heart racing with equal parts excitement and fear. "It's beautiful," said her best friend, Rachel, leaning forward on the couch. "Michael's going to cry when he sees you." Abigail smiled, but her reflection didn't entirely match the emotion she tried to project. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of wedding preparations, guest lists, and floral arrangements. Yet somewhere beneath the joy, a tiny voice kept whispering questions she wasn't ready to answer. "You okay?" Rachel asked, noticing the slight hesitation in Abigail's expression. "Yeah," Abigail said quickly. "Just overwhelmed, I guess." Rachel studied her. "It's normal to have cold feet." "It's not that," Abigail replied, turning back to the mirror. "It's just, Michael's been through so much. I want to make sure I'm everything he needs." "Abby, stop." Rachel rose and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You already are. He's crazy about you. Anyone can see that." Abigail smiled softly. She wanted to believe it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was holding something back. There had been moments, fleeting but noticeable, where he seemed almost too perfect, too rehearsed. And yet, every time doubt crept in, she pushed it away, reminding herself that love meant trust. Later that evening, Abigail sat across from Michael at their favorite Italian restaurant. Candles flickered between them, casting a warm glow over his face. "You look distracted," he said, setting down his fork. "Wedding stress?" She forced a laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "To me? Always." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't have to do this alone, Abby. We're a team, remember?" She squeezed his fingers. "I know. I guess I just want everything to be perfect." "It already is," he said softly. "Because it's us." Her heart melted at his words, but as he smiled at her, that flicker of doubt returned. She pushed it down again, reminding herself that love wasn't about perfection, it was about choosing each other, flaws and all. In the days leading up to the wedding, Michael continued to show her just how deeply he cared. He surprised her with handwritten notes, little gifts, and late-night phone calls to calm her nerves. Abigail clung to those moments, using them to silence the nagging voice in her mind. One evening, as they finalized seating charts, Michael reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're my everything, Abby," he said. "I hope you know that." "I do," she whispered. "And you're mine." He kissed her softly, and for a brief moment, all her fears disappeared. But as the final preparations fell into place, Abigail found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling. The logical part of her brain told her she was just nervous, every bride felt this way before the big day. And yet, something about Michael's past, the way he avoided details, the guarded looks he occasionally gave her, refused to leave her thoughts. Still, she told herself it didn't matter. They were in love. And love was enough. Wasn't it? Abigail stood in front of the mirror, her reflection almost unrecognizable. Her hair flowed in soft waves over her shoulders, and the delicate lace of her gown hugged her frame perfectly. She traced the edge of her veil with trembling fingers, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Ready?" Her best friend, Lily, peeked into the room, her eyes shining with excitement. Abigail smiled nervously. "As ready as I'll ever be." "You look stunning. Michael's going to lose it when he sees you." The mention of Michael's name sent a wave of calm over her. Despite the nerves, she knew this was right. Michael was the man she wanted to spend her life with, kind, strong, and endlessly patient. The music began outside, signaling it was time. Abigail took a deep breath and looped her arm through her father's. "You sure about this?" he whispered, his voice gentle. Abigail smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." Her father kissed her cheek, and they stepped through the doors. Michael waited at the end of the aisle, his eyes fixed on her as if she were the only person in the world. Abigail felt tears welling up as she met his gaze. He looked so handsome in his tailored suit, sitting proudly in his wheelchair, his expression filled with love and admiration. As Abigail reached him, he took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're breathtaking," he whispered. "And you're stuck with me now," she teased. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows, laughter, and happy tears. When Michael slid the ring onto her finger, Abigail felt her heart swell with a love so intense it was almost overwhelming. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant said. "You may kiss the bride." Michael cupped her face, and as their lips met, the room erupted in applause. The reception was exactly what Abigail had dreamed of, intimate and filled with warmth. Strings of fairy lights danced overhead as guests mingled, sipping champagne and celebrating the newlyweds. Abigail sat beside Michael at the head table, her hand resting on his. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good." He smiled, but there was something in his eyes, anticipation, maybe even nerves. The DJ's voice interrupted her thoughts. "And now, it's time for the first dance." Abigail's pulse quickened as Michael turned to her. "You ready?" She nodded, but before she could stand, Michael reached for the arms of his wheelchair. "Wait, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he gripped the chair's handles and, with a slow, deliberate motion, pushed himself up. Gasps rippled through the room as Michael stood, unsteady but upright. Abigail froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Michael." He took a step toward her, then another. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Abigail couldn't move. He held out his hand. "Dance with me?" Her legs felt rooted to the ground as questions flooded her mind. How was this possible? How had he hidden this from her? Still, her body moved on instinct, her hand slipping into his. Michael pulled her close, swaying gently as the music played. "You can walk," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can," he admitted. "I always could." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She pulled back, staring at him in disbelief. Why would you lie to me?" Michael's expression shifted, guilt replacing the joy he'd worn moments earlier. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Abigail. I just—" "No," she interrupted, stepping back. "Not here. Not now." The music played on, but the room felt suddenly suffocating. Abigail turned and hurried out, leaving Michael standing in the center of the dance floor, alone. Abigail slammed the door behind her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The night air was cool, but she barely noticed. Her mind spun as Michael's confession echoed in her ears. "I can walk. I always could." The words felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She paced along the garden path outside the reception hall, the sound of laughter and music fading into the background. How could he have lied to her? How could he have let her believe he was someone he wasn't? "Abigail." She froze. Michael's voice came from behind her, but she didn't turn. She couldn't. "Abby, please," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Let me explain." Slowly, she faced him. He stood, no wheelchair, no pretense. He looked different now, taller, more imposing, yet somehow smaller under the weight of her anger. "Explain," she snapped. "Explain how you let me fall in love with someone you pretended to be?" Michael took a step closer, his hands raised. "I didn't pretend to be someone else. Everything I told you, everything I felt for you, was real." "Real?" Her voice cracked. "You lied about the most fundamental part of who you are." He flinched but didn't back away. "I was scared, Abby. Scared that if you saw me for who I really am, you wouldn't love me. I've been burned before, hurt so badly I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone again." Abigail crossed her arms, her heart pounding. "So you tested me? Is that what this was? Some kind of twisted game to see if I'd stay?" "No." Michael's voice broke. It wasn't a game. It was the only way I knew how to protect myself. Abigail shook her head, tears blurring her vision. You think love is about tests? About setting traps to see if someone's worthy of you? That's not love, Michael. That's fear. His shoulders slumped. You're right. For a moment, the only sound was the distant murmur of the party inside. Then Michael spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I hated myself for doing it. Every day, I wanted to tell you the truth, but I was terrified of losing you. He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. I didn't mean to hurt you, Abby. I love you. I love you so much that I couldn't risk losing you. Abigail's tears spilled over. You already lost me. Michael's face crumbled. Don't say that. I need time, she said, her voice trembling. I need space to think about what this means, about who we are. Abby, please. No, Michael. She stepped back, shaking her head. Not tonight. Michael didn't follow her as she turned and walked away. Abigail spent the next few days in a fog. She ignored Michael's calls and texts, unable to face him. Her emotions shifted between anger, sadness, and confusion. Lily came over to check on her, bringing takeout and an endless supply of tissues. I still can't believe he did that, Lily said, shaking her head. I mean, who even thinks of something like that? I don't know, Abigail admitted, staring at the engagement ring she hadn't been able to take off. Part of me wants to hate him. But the other part still loves him, Lily finished gently. Abigail nodded. I do. And that's the hardest part. Lily reached out, squeezing her hand. You don't have to decide anything right now. Take the time you need. If he really loves you, he'll wait. Days turned into a week, and Abigail finally agreed to meet Michael. They sat across from each other at a quiet park, the tension thick between them. I didn't think you'd come, Michael said softly. I almost didn't, Abigail replied. He ran a hand through his hair. I've spent every day since the wedding trying to figure out how to make this right. Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning? Michael exhaled. Because I didn't think you'd stay. Abigail's eyes filled with tears. You didn't trust me. I didn't trust anyone. His voice broke. Not after my ex-fiancé left me when I lost my job and everything else fell apart. I was broken, Abby. And when I met you, I wanted so badly to believe that someone could love me for who I was, not for what I had or didn't have. Abigail swallowed hard. But you never gave me the chance to prove that. Michael nodded, shame clouding his face. I know. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life if I've lost you because of it. Abigail looked down, twisting the ring on her finger. I need to know that this, us, can be built on honesty, not lies. It can, Michael said firmly. I swear to you, no more secrets. No more tests. Just me, as I am, for as long as you'll have me. Abigail's heart ached at the raw sincerity in his voice. She wanted to believe him. But trust wasn't something that could be repaired overnight. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said quietly. Michael's shoulders fell. I understand. But I want to try. Hope flickered in his eyes. You do? She nodded. I'm not ready to just forget what happened, but I don't want to walk away from what we had either. Michael reached across the table, taking her hand. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of your forgiveness. Abigail squeezed his hand, her heart still heavy but a small part of it beginning to mend. Abigail sat on the worn leather couch in her apartment, staring at the engagement ring on her finger. It caught the light, sparkling in a way that felt almost mocking now. She had agreed to try to forgive, try to move forward, but the weight of Michael's deception lingered. She pulled the ring off and set it on the coffee table, its absence on her hand leaving her feeling exposed. The silence in the room pressed down on her, filling the space Michael's laughter once occupied. Abigail reached for her phone, scrolling through their old messages. Texts filled with playful teasing and sweet confessions. But now, every word felt tainted. She wanted to believe his love was real, but how could she trust it when the foundation of their relationship had been built on a lie? Her thumb hovered over his name in her contacts. She hadn't heard from him since their talk in the park 2 days ago, and the space between them felt wider than ever. She missed him, his voice, his presence, the way he made her laugh even when she didn't feel like smiling. But missing him didn't erase the hurt. The next morning, Abigail went for a run, hoping the rhythm of her feet against the pavement would quiet her thoughts. It didn't. She replayed every moment of their relationship, analyzing every conversation, searching for signs she had missed. By the time she reached the park, she was out of breath, not from running, but from the storm inside her. She collapsed onto a bench and let the tears come. "Abby?" Her head snapped up, and there he was. Michael. He looked just as broken as she felt. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said softly, taking a tentative step closer. Abigail quickly wiped her eyes. "It's fine." They stood in silence for a moment before Michael sat beside her. "I've been giving you space," he said, staring down at his hands. "But it's killing me." She swallowed hard. "I know. I miss you," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every second." Abigail turned to face him. "I miss you too, Michael. But that doesn't change what happened." He nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't expect it to. I don't know how to fix this." Neither did she. That night, Abigail lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the way Michael had looked at her in the park, the vulnerability in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. She thought about the stories he'd told her about his past, the pain he'd carried long before he met her. She reached for her phone and began typing. "I can't stop thinking about everything. About us. I don't know how to move forward, but I don't want to let go either." She hesitated, then hit send. Her phone vibrated almost immediately. "Neither do I. I'll do whatever it takes, Abby. Just tell me what you need." She didn't reply right away. Instead, she stared at his words, letting them settle into her heart. Maybe there was a way forward, but it wouldn't be easy. Over the next week, Abigail and Michael started rebuilding, piece by piece. It began with long, honest conversations about his fears, her insecurities, and the mistakes they'd both made. Michael opened up about his past, about the ex-fiancée who had left him when he hit rock bottom. She said she couldn't handle it, he admitted one night. And I believed her. I believed no one could. Abigail's heart ached for him. "But I'm not her, Michael." "I know that now," he said, reaching for her hand. "And I hate that it took losing you to realize it." They started attending counseling together, a decision that Abigail insisted on and Michael readily agreed to. Their sessions forced them to confront hard truths, not just about the lie Michael had told, but about the fears and insecurities that had led him there. "I felt like I had to be someone else to deserve her love," Michael said during one session. "But the truth is, I didn't even give her the chance to love the real me." Abigail squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. "I fell in love with you, Michael. The man you were, even in that chair. I just need to know I can trust the man you are now." Weeks passed, and slowly, Abigail began to feel the cracks in her heart start to heal. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't perfect. Some days were harder than others. But Michael showed up, consistently, patiently, and with a humility that softened her walls. One evening, as they sat in her living room, Abigail reached for the ring that had remained on her coffee table since the night of the wedding. She turned it over in her fingers before looking up at him. "I'm not ready to put this back on yet," she said softly. Michael nodded. "I understand. But I want to get there." His eyes filled with hope. "So do I." Abigail smiled through her tears. "Then let's keep trying." Abigail stood at the edge of the dance floor, her fingers brushing the fabric of her dress as she nervously smoothed the folds. The lights overhead sparkled, casting soft shadows across the room. It wasn't another wedding, but it felt just as significant. Michael had invited her to this event, another fundraiser, like the one where they had first met. It was supposed to be a chance to show her how far they had come, a small step toward rebuilding what had been broken. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she came anyway. Michael spotted her the moment she entered, his eyes lighting up in a way that still made her chest tighten. He crossed the room toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, as though he didn't want to startle her. "You came," he said softly. Abigail offered a small smile. "I said I would." He extended his hand. "Dance with me?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Her mind flashed back to their wedding night, the music, the applause, the moment when everything had unraveled. But this time, there were no secrets. No hidden truths. She hesitated, but then slipped her hand into his. Michael led her to the center of the dance floor, pulling her close as the music started. His movements were gentle, almost cautious, as though afraid she might disappear if he held too tightly. "Thank you for being here," he whispered. Abigail rested her head against his shoulder. "I'm here because I want to be." They moved slowly, the world around them fading. For the first time in weeks, Abigail felt herself letting go of the anger, the betrayal, the fear. She wasn't sure if forgiveness was complete, but in that moment, she knew she still loved him. After the dance, they stepped outside into the cool night air. Michael took her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles against her skin. "I know I don't deserve how much grace you've shown me," he said. "But I need you to know that I'll never take it for granted." Abigail met his gaze. "I believe you." Michael exhaled in relief, his shoulders finally relaxing. "I'm not perfect, Abby. And I'll probably mess up again, but..." She pressed a finger to his lips. "Don't ruin the moment," she teased. He smiled, his eyes softening. "I love you." "I love you too," she said, the words no longer carrying hesitation. Later that evening, as they walked back toward the car, Michael paused. "I have one more thing," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the engagement ring. Abigail froze. "Don't worry," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to put it back on right now. I just wanted to give it back to you, not as a promise of perfection, but as a reminder that I'm willing to earn your trust every single day." Abigail stared at the ring for a long moment before taking it. She didn't slide it onto her finger, but she held it tightly in her palm. "Thank you," she said softly. Michael leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Abigail smiled, feeling something shift inside her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt certain they could walk it together. Abigail sat cross-legged on the couch, a cup of tea warming her hands as Michael leaned back in the armchair across from her. The soft hum of rain against the windows filled the room, a quiet backdrop to the conversation they had danced around for days. "Do you ever think about that night?" Abigail asked, her voice breaking the silence. Michael looked up, his eyes heavy with the weight of her question. "Every single day." She set her cup down, leaning forward. "I mean, the moment you stood up, the look on my face. Did you regret it?" Michael swallowed hard. "I regretted it the second I saw the hurt in your eyes. I thought I'd lose you forever." Abigail's gaze softened. "You almost did." He nodded. "And I'll never forgive myself for putting you through that. I let my fear control me, and I hurt the one person I never wanted to hurt." Abigail took a slow breath. "I want to move past it, Michael. But I need to know you're not just saying what I want to hear. I need to know you've really changed." Michael sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm not the same man I was then, Abby. Therapy's helped me face the parts of myself I tried to hide, even from you." She studied him, searching for signs of doubt or hesitation, but there were none. His sincerity shone through, raw and unguarded. "I've learned," he continued, "that trust isn't something you can test. It's something you build, day by day. And I want to keep building it with you, for as long as you'll let me." Abigail's heart swelled. She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. But the scars of betrayal didn't heal overnight. "I'm willing to try," she said finally. "But it has to be both of us, Michael. We can't go back to the way things were. We have to move forward, together." Michael reached across the space between them, taking her hand. "Together," he promised. Over the next few weeks, they worked on rebuilding what had been broken. Michael surprised her by showing up at her office with lunch, leaving handwritten notes in her purse, and even joining her at yoga classes despite his lack of flexibility. "You're terrible at this," Abigail teased one morning as Michael struggled to hold a downward dog pose. "Hey, I'm trying," he said, collapsing onto the mat with a grin. Abigail laughed, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel forced. They continued therapy sessions, addressing not just Michael's insecurities but also Abigail's fears of being too trusting. Slowly, she began to let her walls down, opening her heart again piece by piece. One evening, as they walked through the park, Michael stopped beneath the twinkling string lights wrapped around the trees. Abigail turned to him. "What is it?" He pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page marked with a ribbon. "I've been writing letters to you," he said, "every day since the wedding. Letters I was too afraid to give you until now." Abigail took the notebook, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The first entry was dated the day after their disastrous wedding. "Dear Abby, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need you to know how much I love you. How much I hate what I did. I was scared of losing you, but in trying to keep you, I pushed you away. I'll never stop fighting for you." Abigail's eyes blurred with tears as she flipped through more pages, each one filled with words of apology, love, and hope. "You've been writing these the whole time?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Every day," Michael said. "Because even when I thought I'd lost you, I couldn't let go." Abigail closed the notebook and stepped into his arms, holding him tightly. "Thank you for not giving up," she said, her voice trembling. "I never will," he whispered. And for the first time, Abigail felt the cracks in her heart begin to close. Abigail stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the soft fabric of her dress. It wasn't a wedding gown this time, just a simple ivory dress that brushed her knees, but it felt just as meaningful. Her heart pounded as she adjusted her necklace, catching her reflection. This day wasn't about starting over, it was about moving forward. The sound of a knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. Lily poked her head inside, her face lighting up. "You look beautiful," she said, stepping in and closing the door behind her. Abigail smiled. "Thank you. Are you ready?" Abigail took a deep breath. "I think so." Lily squeezed her hand. "You've come so far, Abby. You deserve this." Abigail nodded, feeling the weight of her journey settle into something lighter. She wasn't the same woman who had stood at the altar months ago, filled with hope and unspoken fears. She was stronger now, wiser, too. And she was ready. The ceremony took place at sunset in the park where they had first begun to heal. String lights glimmered above the gathering, casting a soft glow on the smiling faces of their closest friends and family. Abigail walked down the aisle slowly, her gaze fixed on Michael, who stood waiting for her at the end. He looked different, lighter, freer. But his eyes still held the same love she had fallen for. When she reached him, he took her hands, his grip steady. "You look incredible," he whispered. "So do you," she replied, her voice soft but certain. The officiant smiled warmly. "We're gathered here today to celebrate a love that has been tested and strengthened, proving that trust and forgiveness can create something even more beautiful than we imagined." Abigail and Michael exchanged vows, not traditional ones, but words they had written themselves. Michael went first. "Abigail, you have shown me what it means to love without conditions. You've taught me how to be vulnerable, how to face my fears, and how to grow into the man I want to be. I promise to keep learning, to keep showing up for you, and to never stop earning your trust. I love you more than words can say." Abigail's voice wavered as she began her vows. "Michael, you have shown me that love isn't about being perfect, it's about being honest, even when it's hard. You've taught me to fight for what matters and to believe in second chances. I promise to keep choosing you, day after day, and to walk beside you no matter where life takes us." Tears shimmered in their eyes as the officiant spoke the final words. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife, again." Michael laughed softly, brushing a tear from Abigail's cheek before kissing her. The applause around them faded as they melted into each other, the world narrowing to just the two of them. The reception was small but filled with joy. Abigail danced with Michael, this time without fear or hesitation. When he spun her around, she couldn't stop smiling. "You're getting pretty good at this," she teased. "Must be the company," he replied with a grin. As the night wore on, Abigail stepped outside for a moment, needing a breath of fresh air. Michael followed, slipping his arms around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. Abigail leaned back against him. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. It wasn't easy, but," she turned to face him. "I wouldn't change a thing." Michael kissed her forehead. "Neither would I." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms as the stars glittered above them. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, it was better. It was real. And as Abigail rested her head against Michael's chest, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.